Hey everyone, today we will cover how to have an effective weekly check-in meeting. So let me start with a quiz. Which of these following do you think is the top motivator for your team members? Options are the usual ones: incentives, recognition, clear goals, interpersonal support, or support for making progress. Now, most leaders actually think that the number one motivator essentially is having clear goals and incentives. And by the way, these are all required. But in terms of the most important thing, there was a very good study done by Teresa and Steven, they have a fantastic book, highly recommended, The Progress Principle. And in their book, what they did is they did a pretty exhaustive survey of 200 plus employees across various companies, various industries, tracking 12,000 plus entries, daily diary entries from these employees. And what they found out based on this detailed study is that the number one motivator, the absolute top motivator, is support in making progress towards meaningful goals. This is a number one thing everyone on the team is looking for. And just to reiterate, all the bullets here are required, right? You cannot make progress without having clear goals, incentives, recognition, everything that goes with it. But the absolute number one thing they found is support in making meaningful progress. Right? Now, from that standpoint, when you think about the key goal of a weekly check-in, the key goal is to help everyone on your team make progress towards the weekly outcomes. Now, before we go further, I want to distinguish between check-in versus checking up. So checking in is different from checking up. Checking in is all about collaboration and working together. And checking up essentially is, basically asking constantly questions as to, have you finished your task? Things which would be micromanaging, or you're really sort of creating a judgment on their talents and skills and so on. It really constrains experimentation and kills the motivation and creativity. So let's be very clear, checking in is very different from checking up. Checking in is let's work together, let's collaborate and make sure the weekly goal is accomplished. So with that perspective, what do you need to do in the check-in meeting? Basically, a 15-minute weekly check-in with everyone in your team. And in this check-in meeting, you're basically covering 3 questions. Any blockers in accomplishing this week's priorities? What do you plan to work on next week? And how can I help? What can I do to help? These 3 questions. 15 minutes, everyone, once a week, in everyone on your team. And you may say, I keep connecting with them, I talk to them, and there are various different forums. One thing I have learned is having a separate dedicated time as check-in meeting really helps, because oftentimes, even in all those meetings, these 3 questions: what's blocking their week progress this week? What do they want to plan to do next week? And what can you do to help? By explicitly putting that question, it really sort of, you'll be amazed by what you learn, essentially. Now, as you ask these 3 questions, what is your role as a leader? You are essentially focusing on the following. For the first question, are there any blockers in accomplishing this week's priorities? Your focus here is, how do I roll up my sleeve and work together in getting past the finish line? You're not at that point judging, looking at skills and any of that stuff. You're focusing on what has to happen to get past the finish line. And as you're doing that, opportunities to provide constructive feedback and share ideas, share strategies. Everybody's on a learning journey here. So always put on that perspective. For the second question, what do you plan to work on next week? Really ensure there's alignment of your goal and the expectation to the planned work. This is your opportunity to really clarify if that activity or the task that they are planning to work on next week is aligned, as well as maybe even spell out specific expectation of that task. So really make sure this is your course correction, course setting aspect. And this is something that you're listening in for. This is the perfect opportunity to have that discussion about the task. And the last one, what can I do to help? There definitely might be specific things in terms of dependencies, help thinking through design, thinking through different permutations. Make sure that you're taking action items for yourself and promptly following back with, the employee, with the team member that brought it up. So that's really what you're doing in that 15-minute check-in. You may be wondering, a lot to cover, 15 minutes. It typically works out well. I think as you start rolling, initial iterations might take little time, but once you have the rhythm of a weekly meeting, within a few weeks, you will actually see that this is a really time efficient meeting. So wrapping up, takeaways, 3 of them. First, set up a 15-minute meeting, 15-minute check-in meeting with everyone. Again, check in, not checking up. Your mindset in that meeting is collaborate, getting past the finish line, really working together. It's not a blame game. It's not a judgment game. Yes, along the way, you can provide constructive feedback on ideas and strategies as you're sort of doing that. Second, cover the 3 questions we talked about and really provide constructive feedback as required. This is the part of continuous feedback that you want to provide. This is not waiting for once every 6 months or the yearly evaluation cycle. Think of this as continuous feedback. No surprises in terms of whether they are working on the right tasks, whether they're meeting your expectations. This is the right opportunity. Okay, now that I've introduced this, I'm hoping that all of you will have check-in meetings with your team members. Now, I'm going to give an assignment to make sure that we are learning. And again, this is a learning journey. So the assignment for this specific lesson is in your weekly check-in that you do this week. How did you distinguish between competency issues versus a genuinely difficult challenge that the team member was facing? It's a very interesting problem. And your focus should actually be to get past the challenge and get it done, but also building the right insights, right? As you're doing this, which is, was the task that challenging versus, there might be some skill gap or training gap that you should be thinking about for the team member. So that's it, folks. That's the lesson for this week. Thanks, everyone.